Hello, my name is Justyna Olko. I work at the University of Warsaw, where I direct the Center for Research and Practice in Cultural Continuity. And I will talk today how the use of heritage languages relates to the well-being and resilience of ethnic minority speakers. It is well known through a number of research projects carried out in different parts of the world that the loss of heritage languages in the case of indigenous and ethnic minority groups brings very severe consequences for the speakers, and the transition to the dominant language and the assimilation with the outgroup, often in the context of modern nation states, is not neutral in terms of health results and other important outcomes for members of minority communities. And one of such consequences, for example, among the indigenous people of the Americas is the elevated suicide rates among young people. But there are also severe health outcomes and many other effects of intergenerational historical trauma. But on the other hand, the retention of heritage languages can not only reduce this negative consequences associated with the pressure of assimilation, but also bring about some positive outcomes for minority speakers. And this positive results of the retention and continued speaking of heritage languages has been the principal object of our the principal area of interest for our collaborative team project, Language as a Cure, Linguistic Vitality as a Tool for Psychological Well-being, Health and Economic Sustainability, that we've been carrying out since since December 2017, in close collaboration with ethnic minorities living in their area of Poland, and also the indigenous people in Mexico, especially speakers of the Nahuatl language. One of our early findings was that speaking the Lemko language, and Lemko is the language of a recognized ethnic minority in the area of Poland, actually helps to reduce the effects, the negative effects of a historical trauma that this group has been suffering since some traumatic events associated with their forced displacement as part of the so-called Operation Vistula in 1947. So as you can see in this diagram, the people who more frequently use their heritage language, the Lemko language, have lesser effects, negative psychological effects of that are associated with the historical trauma. Our another study just published this fall explores the positive relationship between indigenous language use and community-based well-being in 4 Nahuatl ethnic groups in Mexico, and this is research carried out together with indigenous researchers from Mexico. The Nahuas are the descendants of the Aztecs, and they, the so-called Aztecs, this is a very popular term both in historiography and, let's say, popular view, and they still live and practice their many elements of their traditional culture and speak their languages or their language, the variants of the Nahuatl language in different regions of Mexico. And in this study, we collaborated with 4 communities, very traditional communities in Guerrero, in Atliaca, still where the community still speaks Nahuatl language in about 80%, according to the last census, and Chicontepec in Veracruz, also very huge retention of the Nahuatl language, despite heavy assimilation pressures and ethnic discrimination to which the speakers are subject. And then Gilitla in San Luis Potosi, where the language loss is more advanced, to Tlaxcala, the region of Contla in Tlaxcala, the most urbanized context where speakers Actually, very few speakers today still continue speaking the language, and they are mostly the elderly people. And our study embraced the total of 552 persons from these 4 regions. And our instruments used in this study embraced our own measurement scale, developed as a result of fieldwork with participation of community members and indigenous scholars. And this scale, which we called community-based well-being, was developed to measure community-based well-being in the sense of how local people conceptualize their happiness and what was the notion of good life for them. We also measured the use of Nahuatl and Spanish across different domains of everyday life. All these communities are bilingual, but this bilingualism is highly unstable. We also developed a scale for measuring positive emotions related with the use of Nahuatl, and we use a standard scale, satisfaction with life scale, measuring psychological well-being has been widely used in social psychology for several decades and in a number of contexts. And in our research, we tested the hypothesis that there is a relationship between the use of Nahuatl in a family context and this community-based well-being mediated by positive emotions that the speakers experience when they speak their heritage language. This is our mediation model, where the relationship between the well-being and the use of the language is mediated by positive emotions. And we also looked at the moderated mediation model. So we added an ethnic group, the specific region where the communities live, as the moderator of this relationship. And this model turned out to be positive for one community, for one region in Guerrero. This is Atliaca. As I mentioned before, there is the retention of the language, of the heritage language there, at least at the level of about 80% of the community members who can still speak and use the language, the heritage language. So this was the least acculturated, the least assimilated community within our sample. And indeed, we can see that this effect is statistically significant. So there is this significant relationship between the use of the heritage language and well-being, but it's mediated by positive emotions that the speakers experience. We then, since this relationship was not significant for other regions, we tested our second hypothesis that there is a direct relationship between speaking the language and well-being, and that positive emotions do not play any role in this relationship. So this was basically our second model about the direct relationship. But we took, of course, the belonging to a specific group as a moderator, and the result is the following. This direct relationship was most significant for the community of Contla in Tlaxcala, which is most affected by the language loss and assimilation policies, and then it's followed by moderately assimilated region Xilitla, where the language loss is also strong, but it's sort of intermediate between Atliaca and Chicontepec and Contla. And it's also significant for Chicontepec, where over 50% of inhabitants of the region still speak the language. And it's not significant for Atliaca, where we already demonstrated that this relationship actually is mediated by positive emotions. So the strongest effect that we've seen between the language use and well-being, depending whether people use little the heritage language or they use it more often, is valid for the most assimilated communities, as Contla and Xilitla. This shows that the protective role of heritage languages with regard to well-being may be indeed stronger in communities that are more affected by assimilation processes than in more traditional communities. So the protective role of an endangered language, even if it's not spoken very often, or it's only spoken by some sectors of the society, the positive influence of the retention of the language for the community-based well-being is indeed stronger. Since one of the main problems of language endangerment and the shift to dominant languages is the very low perceived economic value of minority languages that are perceived as not being useful on job market, and they are not seen as useful for social advancement. They are not. They are often seen as an obstacle in education. So parents do not want to speak the language, the heritage language, their children to reduce the risk of them being not only stigmatized, but also having worse job opportunities in the future. We also decided to look at this aspect, and we developed a scale and that measures the economic value of the language, of the local language, and we applied it to the context of our study. And it turned out that although Nahuatl in Mexico is not very, doesn't offer obvious advantages in the job market, and it's definitely not significant not widely used as a language of education. Nevertheless, community members still perceived, they believe that the language has some economic value in the context of a local economy and economic relationships in their communities. And it turned out that for people who see their economic value of their language as higher, the relationship between the usage of the language and their well-being is stronger. You can see it by this dotted line. And for those who saw the economic value of the heritage language as low, actually this relationship is much weaker. So this result, it's still that hasn't been published. It's a paper co-written by Katarzyna Lubiewska and other co-authors. It's still in development, in progress. It's actually showing that it's very important to invest in the perceived economic value of endangered languages and minority languages, and this economic value, of course, can be much different from standard economic values attached to those languages that operate in the market, the dominant languages that have certain kinds of prestige and economic benefits attached to them. But still, it's a very important issue in the context of minority languages. Another theme that's related to this discussion and relevant for this discussion, and also it's an object of our research, is how indigenous resilience becomes an important asset to the pressures of assimilation, and what role does it have in the preservation of endangered languages. And in this picture, you can see the revitalizer of the Wymish language in Poland, and we also work with this community within our project, Tymoteusz Król speaking to other community members. And this is a very small linguistic community, but nevertheless, despite its very high levels of endangerment and very few speakers left, the community, thanks to the efforts of young revitalizers of the language, has been able to keep the language until the present moment, and actually the number of speakers is among the youngest generation is increasing as a result of language revitalization activities. And this case, but also many other cases around the world, show that there are apparent anomalies within a language choice model, rational choice model, that contradict the principle of utility maximization. And quoting Latin, in other words, minority groups sometimes resist assimilation and refuse, quote, to disappear from the historical stage. So are these adaptive responses to the social, linguistic, and economic evolution of minority languages that are because of their low economic and social value, they are doomed to disappear? Or is it the result of indigenous resilience that still protects the speakers of these languages from disappearing from the linguistic maps? And a case study I would like to use in this discussion relates to the ethnic minority of Kashubians in Poland, who are not recognized as an ethnic minority, but their language is recognized since 2005 as a regional language. And according to the 2011 census, there are 108,000 active speakers of the language, people who use Kashubian at home, and they live in the northwestern area of Poland. And in our paper published a year ago in +1, we showed that actually experienced discouragement to the use of the Kashubian language relates to the empowerment of speakers and to their more frequent use of the Kashubian language. A huge number of participants, up to 61% of participants, admitted that at some point in their lives they experienced discouragement towards speaking their mother tongue, Kashubian. And for 31 to 36%, this happened often or very often in their lives. And as many as 70% of the Kashubians who participated in our study actually were convinced that some institutions in the present still advocate against speaking Kashubian. And we found out that this relationship that we observed, a surprising relationship between increased discouragement and increased language use, is actually mediated by positive emotions. So the study, which was carried out on the group that was perhaps not representative for the broader Kashubian community, but for more active and interested in persons interested in their language and culture, showed that people who were discouraged in the past use their language, their heritage language, more often now, and this relationship is mediated through positive emotions. In our interpretation, we think that this is related to the act of resilience and resistance toward experienced discouragement, and that speakers, and some of the speakers actually went through self-empowerment as active members of the ethnic minority and developed a positive attachment to their ethnic identity and to speaking the language, which contributes to their higher usage of the heritage language. So obviously, there are a number of studies that show how ethnic discrimination impacts in a negative way the cultural and linguistic retention and the use of languages. But apparently this is not always so for some groups, that for some active members of ethnic minorities, discouragement can also lead to the acts of resistance toward assimilation pressures. And a similar observation was actually published this year in an interview by a famous Silesian writer, Szczepan Twardoch, who noticed in the context of pandemic, where the Silesian minority, another huge ethnic minority, unrecognized ethnic minority in Poland, suffered from a lot of stigma. He noticed, quote, "There is some perverse way in which every bit of contempt and scorn shown by Poland towards Silesians makes me happy. For each such act, there is a person somewhere out there who decides to go against and to nurture their Silesianness." Just to mention some numbers, in the 2011 census, almost 530,000 100,000 people declared speaking Silesian at home, and 140,000 declared Silesian to be their native language. And this group has been permanently, the claims of this group to recognize their language and nationality have been permanently rejected by the Polish state. In the pandemic, they were also heavily stigmatized, and the region was called New Lombardy, as the surge of, in the first phase of the pandemic last year, the huge surge of cases, of confirmed cases, appeared in the region and became associated with the local social situation and also specifics of the local, let's say, economic context linked to coal mines. But this stigma was extended to the members of the Silesian groups, and they were objects of hate speech in many and discrimination in many contexts. But in our survey that was carried out during the pandemic, it lasted from June 2020 until January of this year, we found out that one of the predictors that reduced the general anxiety disorder caused by the pandemic among the Silesians was actually the active use of the Silesian language in different domains of life. This is still a study in progress, but suggests that local languages are not generally acting as predictors of better well-being, but also they can provide some shield and protection during a major health crisis or other adverse events like the pandemic. And indeed, in a parallel COVID-related survey in Mexico that embraced the Nahuatl speakers, but also other major indigenous groups living in different parts of the country, we've been able to document statistically significant differences in the average values of resilience and protective behaviors related to the pandemic. And what we saw was that in the indigenous people, as compared to non-indigenous participants of our survey, had higher resilience during the pandemic, and that they also had higher protective behaviors, such as conforming to strict hygienic norms and in consequence protecting themselves and other community members. And this was statistically higher than participants who only identified themselves as Mexicans without any indigenous identity. And we also looked a bit closer how what actually explains this higher protective behaviors among indigenous people in Mexico. And we noticed several in this regression analysis, we noticed several significant factors, predictors. The negative predictor, reducing the chance of higher protective behaviors, as in other groups, was sharing, believing in common conspiracy theories. But positive predictors, increasing the protective behaviors during the pandemic, was the awareness among these positive predictors, was the awareness of the indigenous history of past epidemics and losses to local communities as the result of past epidemics in colonial times, and also in the 20th century in the context of the so-called Spanish flu. Linguistic angst, or the fear of continuity of the language, the fear of the linguistic survival of the group, and the most significant and strongest predictor was the strength of indigenous ethnic identity. So this results in the context of the pandemic show that indigenous minority languages and also the indigenous identity not only bring significant benefits to their speakers, but also act as protective factors in this kind of crisis as the present context. This encourages further research on the topic, and also calls us to reevaluate the multifaceted value of endangered languages, both for their speakers for local communities and for a broader society. And in the end of this talk, I would like to thank and mention other contributors of our team research reported in this talk who participated in different moments and different stages of the project and contributed in vital ways to the results I reported. Thank you.